What's up, YouTube people? Shaggy the Writer coming at you live from the library once again. Another magnificent evening to be inside reading. It's a little bit stormy, a little bit cloudy, a little bit overcast. All kinds of love goes out to Against the World. Well, I'm sure we'll be in the building soon. Mad love to the folks over at the r/alternate history hub on Discord. All kinds of love to Octawave, who's been tuning into just about every one of these books, I think. Let me see. Renzo Flutes and the rest of the Japanese crew. Uh, Shouts out Rakim and Brittany. All kinds of love goes out to um, Marie, who'll be tuning in sometimes. Uh, Don't Watch Continue. Dog Rose, Dead Mind, wherever you guys are at. It's probably a little late for y'all this evening, but without further ado, Ernest Hemingway's The Torrents of Spring. We're going to actually try to get this whole thing done 90 pages before the library closes in 80 minutes. What do you think? I think it's quite doable. It's divided up into 4 parts. Real quick, the last time I did Hemingway, this stream actually got the volume cut off partway into it. Well, the first half of it, I believe, was actually without volume, and that's quite tragic, as I did kind of run through and give a little bit of background on Hemingway. He is a cancer, a freedom fighter, um, literally got awarded for committing war crimes because they were war crimes against Nazis. Uh, so just all around dope individual with about some of the best works of the old era of early 20th century literature. But today we're just going to try and get through the Torrents of Spring. Chapter 1. Yogi Johnson stood looking out of a window. Big pump factory in Michigan. Spring would soon be here. Could it be that this writing fellow Hutchinson had said, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" would be true again this year? Yogi Johnson wondered. Near, tall, lean man with a lean face. Both stood looked out at the empty yard of the pump factory. Snow covered the created pumps that would soon be shipped away. Once the spring should come and snow melt, workmen from the factory would break out the pumps from the piles where they were snowed in and haul them down to the GR&I station, where they would be loaded onto flat cars and shipped away. Yogi Johnson looked out the window at the snowed-in pumps, and his breath made little fairy tracings on the cold window pane. Yogi Johnson thought of Paris. Perhaps it was where he had once spent 2 weeks, and the little fairy tracings reminded him of the gay city. 2 weeks that were the happiest weeks of his life. That was all behind him now, that and everything else. Scripps O'Neill had 2 wives. As he looked out the window, standing tall and lean and resilient with his own tenuous hardness, he thought of both of them. One lived in Barcelona and the other in Petorsky. He had not seen the wife who lived in Barcelona since last spring. He looked out at the snow-covered pump yards, thought what spring would mean. His wife in Barcelona, Scripps, often got drunk. When he was drunk, he and his wife were happy. They would go down together to the railway station and walk out along the tracks and sit together and drink and watch the trains go by. They would sit under a pine tree on a little hill that overlooked the railway and drink. Sometimes they drank all night. Sometimes they drank for a week at a time. It did them good. It made Scripps strong. Scripps had a daughter whom he playfully called Lousy O'Neill. Her real name was Lucy O'Neill. One night, after Scripps and his woman had been out drinking on the railroad line for 3 or 4 days, he lost his wife. He didn't know where she was. When he came to himself, everything was dark. He walked along the railroad truck toward town. The ties were stiff and hard under his feet. He tried walking on the rails. He couldn't do it. He had the dope on that all right. He went back to walking along the ties. It was a long way to town. Finally, he came to where he could see the lights of the switch on. He got away from the tracks and passed the Barcelona High School. It was a yellow brick building. There was nothing rococo about it, like the buildings had been in Paris. No, he had never been in Paris. That was not he, that was his friend, Yogi Johnson. Yogi Johnson looked out of the window. Soon it would be time to shut up the pump factory for the night. He opened the window carefully, just a crack. Just a crack, but barely enough. Outside in the yard the snow had begun to melt. A warm breeze was blowing. The Chinook wind, the pump fellows called it. A warm Chinook wind came in through the window into the pump factory. All the workmen laid down their tools. Most of them were Indians. The foreman was a short, iron-jawed man. He was once made a trip as far as Duluth. Duluth was as far across the blue waters of the lake in the hills of Minnesota. A wonderful thing had happened to him there. The foreman put his finger in his mouth to moisten it, and held it up in the air. He felt a warm breeze on his finger. He shook his head ruefully and smiled at the men, a little grimly perhaps. "Well, it's a regular Chinook, boys," he said. Silently for the most part, the workmen hung up their tools. The half-completed pumps were put away in their racks. The workmen filed, some of them talking, others silent, a few muttering to the washroom to wash up. Outside through the window came the sound of a Native American war whoop. Chapter 2. Scripps O'Neill stood outside Barcelona High School, looking up at the lighted windows. It was dark and the school was falling. It had been falling ever since Scripps could remember. A passerby stopped and stared at Scripps. After all, what was this man to him? He went on. Scripps stood in the snow and stared at the lighted windows of the high school. Inside, the people were learning things. Far into the night they worked, the boys vying with the girls in their search for knowledge. They searched for the learning of things that was sweeping America. His girl, little Lousy, a girl that had cost him a cool $75 in doctor's bills, was in there learning. Scripps was proud. It was too late for him to learn, but there, day after day and night after night, Lousy was learning. She had the stuff in her, that girl. Scripps went on up to the house. It was not a big house, but it wasn't the size that mattered to Scripps' old woman.
"Scripps," she said when they were drinking together, "I don't want a palace. All I want is a place to keep the wind out."
Scripps had taken her at her word. Now he walked in late evening through the snow, and saw the lights on his own home. He felt glad that he had taken her at her word. It was a better way than if he were coming home to a palace. He, Scripps, was not the sort of chap that wanted a palace. He opened the door of his house and went in. Something kept going through his head. He tried to get out, but it was no good. What was it that poet chap his friend Harry Parker had met once in Detroit had written? Harry used to recite it. "Through pleasures and palaces though I may roam, when you something something something, there's no place like home." He could not remember the words, not all of them. He had written a simple tune to it and taught Lucy to sing it. That was when they were first married. Scripps might have been a composer, one of these chaps that write stuff in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra plays. Orchestra. Wow, that's terrible. Orchestra plays. If he had a chance to go on, he would get Lucy to sing that song tonight. He would never drink again. Drinking robbed him of his ear for music. Times when he was drunk, the sound of the whistles of the trains at night pooling up on the Bourne Falls grade seemed more lovely than anything this chap Stravinsky had ever written. Drinking had done that. He was wrong. He would get away to Paris, like this chap Albert Spaulding that played the violin. Scripps opened the door. He went in. "Lucy, come. It is I, Scripps." He would never drink again. No more nights out on the railroad. Perhaps Lucy needed a new fur coat. Perhaps, after all, she wanted a place instead of this place. You never knew how you were treating the wolf. Perhaps after all this place was not keeping out the wind. Fantastic. He lit a match. Lucy, he called, and there was more of dumb terror in his mouth. His friend Walt Simmons had heard just such a cry from a stallion that had once been run over by the passing autobus in the Palace Verdun in Paris. In Paris there were no geldings. All the horses were stallions. They did not breed mares, not since the war. The war changed all that. Lucy, he called, and again, Lucy. There was no answer. The house was empty. Through the snow-filled air, he stood there, alone in his tall leanness, in his own deserted house. There came to Scrip's ears the distant sound of the Native American war whoop. Uh-oh. Chapter 3. Scripps left Mansalona. He was through with that place. What did a town like that have to give him? There was nothing to it. You worked all your life and then a thing like that happened. The savings of years wiped out. Everything gone. He started to Chicago to get a job. Chicago was the place. Look at its geographical situation, right at the end of Lake Michigan. Chicago would do big things. Any fool could see that. He would buy land in what is now the Loop, the big shopping and manufacturing district. He would buy land at a low price and then hang on to it. Let them try and get it away from him. He knew a thing or two now. Alone, bareheaded, the snow blowing his hair, he walked down the GR&I railway tracks. It was the coldest night he had ever known. He picked up a dead bird that had frozen and fallen into the railroad tracks, and put it inside his shirt to warm it. The bird nestled close to his body, and pecked at his chest gratefully. "Poor little chap," Scripps said. "You feel the cold, too?" Tears came into his eyes. "Drat that wind!" Scripps again, and once again faded into the blowing snow. The wind was blowing straight down from Lake Superior. The telegraph wires above Scripps' head sang in the wind. Through the dark, Scripps saw a great yellow eye coming toward him. The giant locomotive came nearer through the snowstorm. Scripps stepped to one side of the track to let it go by. What was that old fellow Shakespeare says? Might makes right. Scripps thought of that quotation as the train went past him in the snowing darkness. First the engine passed. He saw the firemen bending to fling great shovelfuls of coal into the open furnace door. The engineer wore goggles. His face was lit up by light from the open door of the engine. He was the engineer. It was he who had his hand on the throttle. Scripps thought of the Chicago anarchists who, when they were hanged, said, "Though you throttle us today, you still cannot something with our souls." There was a monument where they were buried in Waldheim Cemetery, right beside the Forest Park amusement park in Chicago. His father used to take Scripps out there on Sundays. The monument was all black, and there was a black angel. That was when Scripps had been a little boy. He used to often ask his father, "Father, if we come to look at the anarchists on Sunday, why can't we ride on the shoot and shoots?" He'd never been satisfied with his father's answer. He had been a little boy in knee pants then. His father had been a great composer. His mother was still an Italian woman from the north of Italy. They are strange people, these North Italians. Scripps stood beside the track, and the long black segments of train clicked by him in the snow. All cars were Pullmans. The blinds were down. Light came in thin slits from the bottom of the dark windows as the cars went by. The train did not roar, as it might have if it had been going in the other direction, because it was climbing the Bourne Falls grade. It went slower than if it had been going down. It was still too fast for Scripps to hitch on. He thought how he had been an expert at hitching on grocery wagons when he was a young boy in knee pants. A long black train of Pullman cars passed Scripps as he stood beside the tracks. Who were in those cars? Were they Americans, piling money while they slept? Were they mothers? Were they fathers? Were they lovers among them? Or were they Europeans, members of a worn-out civilization, world-weary from the war? Scripps wondered. The last car passed him and the train went out to the track. Scripps watched the red light at its stern disappearing into the blackness through which the snowflakes now came softly. The bird fluttered inside his shirt. Scripps started along the ties. He wanted to get to Chicago that night if possible to start work in the morning. The bird fluttered again. It was not so feeble now. Scripps put his hand on it to still its little bird flutterings. The bird was calmed. Scripps strode up on the track. After all, he did not need to go as far as Chicago. There were other places. What if that critic fellow, Henry Micken, had called Chicago the literary capital of America? There were the Grand Rapids. Once in Grand Rapids he could start a furniture business. For fortunes had been made that way. Grand Rapids furniture was famous wherever young couples walked in the evening to talk of homemaking. He remembered a sign he had seen in Chicago as a little boy. His mother had pointed out to him as together they walked barefoot through what is probably the Loop, begging from door to door. His mother loved the bright flashing of the electric lights in the sign.
They are like a San Benito in Manetti, Florence, she told Scripps. Look at them, my son, she said, for some day your music will be played there in the Firenze Symphony Orchestra.
Scripps had watched the sign for hours while his mother slept, wrapped in the old shawl, on what is now probably the Blackstone Hotel. The sign had made a great impression on him. "Let Hartman feather your nest," it had said. It flashed in many different colors. First a pure, dazzling white. That was what Scripps loved best. But then it flashed a lovely green. Then it flashed red. One night as he lay crouched against his mother's body for warmth and watched the sign flash, a policeman came up. "You'll have to move along," he said. Ah, yes, there was big money to be made in the furniture business if you knew how to go about it. He, Scripps, knew all the wrinkles about that game. In his own mind it was settled. He would stop at Grand Rapids. The little bird fluttered happily now. "Ah, what a beautiful gilded cage I've built for you, my pretty one," Scripps said exultantly. The little bird pecked him confidently. Scripps strode on in the storm. The snow was beginning to drift across the track. Borne on the wind, there came to Scripps' ears the sound of a far-off Native American war whoop. Okay, we're gonna just take a real quick pause for chapter 4. That's the only thing I'm screaming is "oh." And that's always for every day, every time, motherfucker, this, oh. What? Shouts out against the world. Gee. Maybe in the building at some point this evening. All kinds of love goes out to you. I know you got a lot of other stuff going on too, though, so I ain't tripping. But mad love to Octawave. So much love to the r/ alternate history of Discord. Those of you who are interested, just holler at me and I will gladly give you the link because it's a very dope Discord to be a part of. Yes. Oh man, all kinds of love to Octawave. Man. Real quick, I'm gonna check Discord, see if we got any questions. That was kind of fun when Lucifer said that time. He got a different name on here and I can't even remember it, which is foolish. Shouts out, don't watch, continue. Shouts out, Dog Rose, Pythagoras, Dead Mind. Shouts out, Raheem and Brittany. Shouts out, Marie. Oh man, a bunch of stuff happened and I didn't get to be on here for it, but that's okay. Man, just all kinds of love to everybody. Just make sure that you hit that like button at some point. It's always good to see viewers. And I got mad love for y'all tuning in this evening. So we could go ahead and get started on chapter 4. Where was Scripps now? He was walking in the night, in the storm. He had become confused. He had started for Chicago after that dreadful night when he had found that his home was no longer. Why had Lucy left? What had become of Lousy? He, Scripps, did not know. Not that he cared. That was all behind him. There was none of that now. He was standing knee-deep in snow in front of a railway station. On the railway station was written in big letters, Petoskey. There were a pile of deer shipped down by hunters from the upper peninsula of Michigan, lying piled the one on the other, dead and stiff, drifted half over with snow on the station platform. Scripps read the sign again. Could this be Petoskey? The man was inside the station, tapping something back of a wicker bucket. He looked at Scripps. Could he be a telegrapher? Something told Scripps that he was. He stepped out of the snowdrift and approached the window. Behind the window, the man worked busily away at the telegrapher's key. Are you the telegrapher? Asked Scripps. Yes, sir, said the man. I'm the telegrapher. How wonderful. The telegrapher eyed him suspiciously. After all, what was this man to him? Is it hard to be a telegrapher? Scripps asked. He wanted to ask the man outrightly if this was Petoskey. He did not know of this great northern section of America, though, and he wished to be polite. The telegrapher looked at him curiously. Say, he asked, are you a fairy? I didn't know that was in there. No, Scripps says. I don't know what being a fairy means. Well, said the telegrapher, what do you carry around a bird for? Bird? Asked Scripps. What bird? That bird that's sticking out of your shirt. Scripps was at a loss. What sort of chap was this telegrapher? What sort of man went in for telegraphy? Were they like composers? Were they like artists? Were they like writers? Were they like the advertising men who would write ads in our national weeklies? Or were they like Europeans drawn and wasted by the war, their best years behind them? Could he tell this telegrapher the whole story? Would he understand? It started home, he began. I passed the Mansalona High School. I know Goyle in Mansalona, the telegrapher said. Maybe you knew her, Ethel Enright. It was no good going on. He would cut the story short. He would give the bare essentials. Besides, it was beastly cold, and cold standing there on windswept sanitation platform. Something told him it was useless to go on. He looked over at a deer lying in a pile stiff and cold. Perhaps they too had been lovers. Some were bucks and some were does. The bucks had horns, that was how you could tell. With cats it was more difficult. In France they geld cats and do not geld the horses. France is a long way off. My wife left me, Scripps said abruptly. I don't wonder if you go around with a damn void sticking out of your shirt, the telegrapher said. What town is this? Scripps asked. The single moment of spiritual communion that they had been dissipated. They had never really had it, but they might have. It was no use now. There was no use trying to capture what had gone, what had fled. Petoskey, the telegrapher replied. Thank you, Scripps said. He turned and walked into the silent, deserted northern town. Luckily, he had $450 in his pocket. He had sold a story to Gregor Horace Lorimer just before he had started off with his old woman on that drinking trip. Why had he gone at all? What was it all about, anyway? Coming toward him down the street came two Indians. They looked at him, but their faces did not change. Their faces remained the same. They went into McCarthy's barber shop. Chapter 5. Scripps O'Neill stood irresolutely before the barber shop. Inside, their men were being shaved. Other men, no different, were having their hair cut. Other men sat against the wall in tall chairs and smoked, awaiting their turn in the barber chairs, admiring that paintings hung on the wall, or admiring their own reflections in the long mirror. Should he, Scripps, go in there? After all, he had $450 in his pocket. He could go where he wanted. He looked once again irresolutely. It was an inviting prospect, the society of men, the warm room, the white jackets of the barbers skillfully snapping away with their scissors or drawing blades diagonally through the leather that covered the face of some man who was getting a shave. They could use their tools, those barbers. Somehow it wasn't what he wanted. He wanted something different. He wanted to eat. Besides, there was his bird to look after. Scripps O'Neill turned his back on the barber shop and strode away up the street of the silently frozen northern town. On his right as he walked, the weeping birches, their branches bare of leaves, hung down to the ground, heavy with snow. To his ears came the sound of sleigh bells. Perhaps it was Christmas. In the South, little children would be shooting off firecrackers and crying, Christmas gift to one another. His father came from the South, even a soldier, back in the days of the Civil War. Sherman had buried their house down in his march to the sea. War is hell, Sherman had said. But you see how it is, Mrs. O'Neill, I've got to do it. He touched a match to the white-pillared old house. If General O'Neill were here, you dastard, his mother had said, speaking her broken English, you'd never have touched a match to that house. Smoke curled up from the old house. The fire was mounting. The white pillars were obscured from the rising smoke wreaths. Scripps held close his mother's linsey woolsey dress. General Sherman climbed back onto his horse and made a low bow.
Mrs. O'Neill,
He said. His Scripps' mother away said that there were tears in his eyes, even if he was a damned Yank. The man had a heart, sir, even if he did not follow its dictates.
Mrs. O'Neill, if the gentleman were here, we could have it out as man to man. As it is, ma'am, war being what it is, I must board your house.
He motioned to one of his soldiers, who ran forward and threw a bucket of kerosene on the flames. The flames rose, and a great column of smoke went up in the still evening air. At the least, the General Sherman, Scripps' mother said triumphantly. That column of smoke will warn the other loyal daughters that you are coming. Sherman bowed.
That is the risk we must take, ma'am.
He clapped his spurs to the horse and rode away, his long white hair floating in the wind. Neither Scripps nor his mother ever saw him again. Odd that he should think of that incident now. He looked up. Facing him was a sign. Brown's Beanery, the Best Buy test. He would go in and eat. That's what he wanted. He would go in and eat that sign. The Best Buy test. Ah, the big beanery eaters were wise fellows. They knew how to get their customers. No ads in the Sunday Evening Post for them. The Best Buy test, that was the stuff. He went in. Inside the door of the beanery, Scripps O'Neill looked around him. There was a long counter, there was a clock, there was a door led into the kitchen. There were a couple of tables, there were a pile of donuts under a glass cover. There were signs put out about the wall advertising things one might eat. Was this, after all, Brown's Beanery?
I wonder,
Scripps asked the elderly waitress who came through the swinging doors from the kitchen.
if you could tell me if this is Brown's Beanery.
Why, yes, sir, said the waitress. The Best Buy test.
Thank you, said Scripps, and he sat down at the counter. I would like to have some beans for myself and some for my bird here.
He opened his shirt and placed the bird on the counter. The bird ruffled his feathers and shook himself. He pecked inquiringly at a ketchup bottle. The elderly waitress put out a hand and stroked him.
Isn't he a manly little fella? She remarked. By the way, she asked a little shamefacedly. What was it you ordered, sir?
Beans, Scripps said, for my bird and myself.
The waitress shoved up a little wicket that led into the kitchen. Scripps had a glimpse of warm, steam-filled room with big pots and kettles and many shining cans on the wall.
The pig and the noisy ones,
the waitress called in a matter-of-fact voice to the open wicket.
One for Boyd.
On the fire,
a voice answered from the kitchen.
How old is your boy?
The elderly waitress asked.
Oh, I don't know, said Scripps. Never saw him before last night. I was walking on the railroad track from Barcelona. My wife left me.
Poor little chap,
the waitress said. She poured a little ketchup on her finger. The bird pecked gratefully at it.
My wife left me, Scripps said. We had been out drinking on the railroad track. We used to go out evenings and watch the trains pass. I write stories. I had a story in the Post and 2 in the Dial. Menken's trying to get a hold of me. I'm too wise for that sort of thing. No polizzi for me. They give me the
Katzenjammers. What was he saying? He was talking wildly. This should never do. He must pull himself together. Schofield Thayer was my best man, he said. I'm a Harvard man. All I want is for one of them to give me my bird a square deal. No more Weltpolitik. Take Dr. Coolidge away. His mind was wandering. He knew what it was. He was faint with hunger. This northern air was too sharp and too keen for him. I say, he said, would you let me have just a few of those beans? I don't like to rush things. I know when to let well enough alone. The waiter came up, and a large plate of beans and a small plate of beans, both steaming, appeared. Here they are, the waitress said. Scripps fell onto a large plate of beans. There was a little pork, too. The bird was eating happily, raising its head after each swallow to let the beans go down. He does that to thank God for those beans, the elderly waitress explained. They're mighty fine beans, too, Scripps agreed. Under the influence of the beans, his head was clearing. What was this rot he'd been talking about, that man Henry Mackin? Was Mackin really after him? It wasn't a pretty prospect to face. He had $450 in his pocket. When that was gone, he could always put an end to things. If they pressed him too far, they would get another big surprise. He wasn't the man to be taken alive. Just let them try it. After eating his beans, his bird had fallen asleep. He was sleeping on one leg with the other leg tucked up under his feathers. When he gets tired of sleeping on that leg, he will change legs and rest, the waitress remarked. We had an old osprey at the home that was like that. Where was your home? Scripps asked. In England, in the Lake District. The waitress smiled a bit wistfully. Wordsworth's country, you know. Ah, these English. They traveled all over the face of the globe. They were not content to remain in their little island. Strange Nordics obsessed with their dreams of empire. I'm so mad because I totally could have done an English voice for this lady the whole time, and I've been trying to play her off Southern. And you know I jump on English voices, but we're gonna stick with Southern because I've been did that. Mad love to Octawave, showing up and showing out. I was not always a waitress, the elderly waitress remarked. I'm sure you weren't. Not half, the waitress went on. It's a rather strange story. Perhaps it will bore you. Not at all, Scripps said. You wouldn't mind if I used the story sometime. Not if you find it interesting, the waitress smiled. You wouldn't use my name, of course. Not if you'd rather I didn't, Scripps said. By the way, could I have another order of the beans? Best by test, the waitress smiled. Her face was lined in gray. She looked like that actress that died in Pittsburgh. What was her name? Lenore Ulrich. In Peter Pan, that was it. They say she just went about veiled. Scripps thought. There was an interesting woman. Was it Lenore Ulrich? Perhaps not. It doesn't matter. You really want some more beans? Asked the waitress. Yes, Scripps answered simply. Once again on the loud ones, Scripps called into the wicket. Lay off the bird. On the fire, came the response. Please go on with your story, Scripps said kindly. It was the year of the Paris exhibition, she began. I was a young girl at the time, a jeune fille. I came all the way from England with my mother. We were going to be present at the opening of our exposition. On our way from Gare du Nord to the hotel of the place Verdun where we lodged, we stopped in the Coiffier shop and made some trifling purchase. My mother, as I recall, purchased an additional bottle of smelling salts, as you call them here in America. She smiled. Yes, go on, smelling salts, Scripps said. We registered as customary in the hotel, where we were given adjoining rooms we had reserved. My mother felt a bit done up by the trip. We dined at our rooms. I was full of excitement about seeing the exposition on the morrow, but I was tired after the journey. We had a rather nasty crossing and slept soundly. In the morning I awoke and called for my mother. There was no answer. I went into the room to awaken Mummy. Instead of Mummy, there was a French general in the bed. Mon Dieu, Scripps said.
I was terribly frightened, the waitress went on, and rang the bell for management. The concierge came up, but I demanded to know where my mother was. But, mademoiselle, the concierge explained, we know nothing about your mother. You came here with General so-and-so. I can't remember the general's name,
Call him General Joffrey.
Scripps suggested. It was a name very like that, the waitress said. I was fearfully frightened and sent for the police and demanded to see the guest register. You'll find that there I am registered with my mother, I said. The police came and the concierge brought up the register. See, madame, he said, you are registered with the general, with whom you came to our hotel last night. I was desperate. Finally, I remembered where the coffee shop was. The police sent for the coffee. An agent of the police brought him in. I stopped at the shop with my mother, I said to the coffee. My mother bought a bottle of aromatic salts.
I remember it, mademoiselle, perfectly, the courtier said. But you were not with your mother. You were with the heir de la France General. You purchased, I believe, a pair of mustache tongs. My books at any rate will show the purchase.
I was in despair. In the meantime, the police had brought me to the cab driver who brought us from the cab to the hotel. He swore that I had never been with my mother. Tell me, does this story bore you?
Go on, says Scripps. If you've ever been as hard up for plots as I have been.
Well, the waitress said, that's all there is to the tale. I never saw my mother again. I communicated with the embassy, but they could do nothing. It was finally established by them that I had crossed the channel with my mother, but they could do nothing beyond that. Tears came into the elderly waitress's eyes. I never saw my mummy again. Never again, not even once.
What about the general?
He finally loaned me 100 francs, not a great sum even in those days, and I came to America and became a waitress. That's all there is to the story.
There's more than that, Scripps said. I'll stake my life that there's more than that.
Sometimes, I feel there is, the waitress said. I feel there must be more than that. Somewhere, somehow, there must be an explanation. I don't know what brought the subject into my mind this morning.
It was a good thing to get it off your mind, Scripps said.
Yes, the waitress smiled, the lines on her face not quite so deep now. I feel better now.
Tell me, Scripps asked the waitress, is there any work in this town for me and my bird?
Honest work? Asked the waitress. I only know of honest work.
Yes, honest work, Scripps said.
They do say they're hiring hands at the new pump factory, the waitress said.
Why shouldn't he work with his hands? Rodin had done it. Cezanne had been a butcher. Renoir, carpenter, Picasso had worked at a cigarette factory in his boyhood. Gilbert Stuart, who painted all those famous portraits of Washington that are reproduced all over the America bars and hang in every schoolroom. And Gilbert Stuart had been a blacksmith. Then there was Emerson. Emerson had been a hod carrier. James Russell Lowell had been, he'd heard, a telegrapher in his youth, like that chap down at the station. Perhaps even now that telegrapher at the station was working on his Thanatopsis, or his Tua waterfowl. Why shouldn't he, Scripps O'Neill, work in a pump factory?
You'll come back again? The waitress asked.
If I may,
Scripps said, and bring the boy.
Yes, Scripps said. The little chap's rather tired now, after all. It was a hard night for him.
I should say it was, agreed the waitress. Scripps went out again into the town. He felt clear-headed and ready to face life. The pump factory would be interesting. Pumps were big things now. Fortunes were made and lost in pumps every day in New York and Wall Street. He knew a chap who cleaned up a cool $500,000 on pumps in half an hour. They knew what they were about, these big Wall Street operators. Outside on the street, they looked up at the sign. Best Buy Test, he read. They had the dope all right, he said. Was it true, though, that there had been a black cook? Just once, just for a woman. The wicket went up, and he thought he caught a glimpse of a black man. Perhaps the chap was only sooty from the stove. Part 2. The Struggle for Life. Oh, man. Very best. Very red pilled. Shouts out Dr. Wave.
shouts out to Against the World G. All my homies over at the r/alternate history hub Discord, and about 1,000 other people. You're probably one of them, my dear viewers, who deserves a much needed shout out. But as I am fairly strapped for time, we're going into chapter 6. Scripps O'Neill was looking for employment. It would be good to work with his hands. He walked down the street away from the beanery and past McCarthy's barbershop. He didn't go into the barbershop. It looked inviting as inviting. Oh my god, why I say invitating? It looked as inviting as ever, but employment, that was what Scripps wanted. He turned sharply around the corner of the barbershop and onto the main street of Petoskey, with a handsome broad street lined either side with brick and pressed stone buildings. Scripps walked along it toward the part of town where the pump factory stood. At the door of the pump factory he was embarrassed. Could this really be the pump factory? True, a stream of pumps were being carried out and set up in the snow. The workmen were throwing pails of water over them to encase them in a coating of ice that would protect them from the winter winds as well as any paint would. But were they really pumps? It might all be a trick. These pump men were clever fellows. I say, Scripps beckoned to one of the workmen who had slashed water over a new raw-looking pump that had just been carried out and stood protestingly in the snow. Are they pumps? They will be in time, the workman said. Scripps knew it was a factory. They weren't going to fool him like that. He walked up to the door. There was a sign on it. Keep out. This means you. Can this mean me? Scripps wondered. He walked on the door a minute. I'd like to speak to the manager, he said, standing quietly in the half-light. Workmen were passing him carrying the new raw pumps on their shoulders. They hummed snatches of songs as they passed. The handles of the pumps flopped stiffly in the dumb protest. Some pumps had no handles. Perhaps, after all, they are the lucky ones. Scripps thought. A little man came up to him. He was well-built, short, with wide shoulders and a grim face. You were asking to see the manager? Yes, sir. I'm the foreman here. What I say goes. Can you hire and fire? Scripps asked. I can do one as easy as the other, the foreman said. I want a job. Any experience? Not in pumps. All right, the foreman said. We'll put you on piecework. Here, Yogi, he called out to one of the men who was standing around looking at the window of the factory. Show this new chum where the starward sag and how to find his way around these diggings. The foreman looked Scripps up and down. I'm an Australian, he said. Hope you like the lay. He walked out. Okay, so just from now on, the foreman is Australian. I'm not gonna do Australians like that too. That's terrible. A man called Yogi Johnson came over from the window. Hey, glad to meet you, he said. He was a chunky, well-built fellow, one of the sort you would see around almost anywhere. He was as though he looked like he'd been through things. The foreman's the first Australian I've ever met, Scripps said. Oh, he's not an Australian, Yogi said. He was just with the Australians once during the war. They made a big impression on him. Were you in the war? Scripps asked. Yeah, Yogi Johnson said. I was the first man to go from Cadillac. Must have been quite an experience. Meant a lot to me, Yogi answered. Come and I'll show you around the works. Scripps followed the man who showed him through the pump factory. It was dark but warm inside the pump factory. Men naked to the waist took pumps as huge tongs and came trotting about on an endless chain, culling the misfits and placing the perfect pumps on another endless chain that carried them up from the cooling room. Other men, Indians for the most part, wearing only breechclouts, broke up into misfit pumps with huge hammers and adazes and rapidly recast them into axe heads, wagon springs, trombone sliders, bullet mounds, all the byproducts of a big pump factory. There was nothing wasted, Yogi pointed out. A group of Indian boys hung into themselves in one of the old tribal shanties, squatted in the corner of the big forging room, slapping little figments that were chipped off the pumps in the casting into the safety razor blades. They work naked, Yogi said. They are searched for as they go out. Sometimes they try to conceal in razor blades and take them out onto bootleg. Must be quite a loss that way, Scripps said. Oh no, Yogi answered. The inspectors get most of them. Upstairs, apart in a separate room, two men were working. Yogi opened the door. One of the old men looked over his steel spectacles and frowned.
You make a draft,
He said.
Shut the door,
The older old man said in a high, complaining voice of the very old. There are two hand workers, Yogi said. They make all the pumps and the manufactory sends them out in the big international pump races. You remember Peerless Pounder that won the pump race in Italy where Frankie Dawson was killed? I read about it in the paper, Scripps answered. Mr. Burrow over there in the corner made the Peerless Pounder all by himself by hand, Yogi said.
I carved it direct from steel with this knife.
Mr. Burrow held up a short-bladed, razor-like looking knife.
Took me 18 months to get it right.
Peerless Pounder was quite a pump, all right.
Oh, the Peerless Pounder was quite a pump, all right,
The high-voiced little old man said.
but we're working on one now that will show its heels away from any of them foreign pumps, aren't we, Henry?
That's Mr. Shaw, Yogi said in an undertone. He's probably the greatest living pump maker.
You boys get along and leave us alone,
Mr. Burrow said. He carved away steadily, his infirm old hands shaking a little between strokes.
Let the boys. Let the boys watch,
Mr. Shaw said.
Where are you from there, young fella?
I've just come from Mansalona, Scripps answered. My wife left me.
Well, you won't have no difficulty finding another one,
Mr. Shaw said.
You are a likely looking fella, but take my advice and take your time. A poor wife ain't much better than no wife at all.
Well, I wouldn't.
I wouldn't say that, Henry.
Mr. Brownlow remarked in his high voice.
Any wife at all is a pretty good wife, the way things are going now. You take my advice, young feller, and go slow. Get yourself a good one this time. Henry knows a thing or two,
Mr. Brownlow said.
He knows what he's talking about there.
He laughed a high, cackling laugh. Mr. Shaw, the old pump maker, blushed.
You boys get along and leave us with our pump making, he said. Henry and me here, we got work to do.
I'm very glad to have met you, Scripps said. Hey, come on, Yogi said. I better get you started. The foreman will be on my butt. He put Scripps to work, colorating pistons in piston coloring room. And Scripps worked there for almost a year. In some ways, it was the happiest year of his life. In other ways, it was a nightmare, a hideous nightmare. In the end, he grew to like it. In other ways, he hated it. Before he knew it, a year had passed. He was still coloring pistons. But what strange things had happened in that year? Often he wondered about them. As he wondered, coloring a piston, now almost automatically, he listened to the lighter that came up from below, where the little Indian lads were shaping what were to be razor blades. As he listened, something rose in his throat and almost choked him. Oh man. Chapter 7. That night, after his first day in the pump factory, the first day, what was or where to become the endless succession of dull piston coloring, Scripps went again to the beanery to eat. All day he had kept his bird concealed. Something told him in that pump factory was not a place to bring his bird out. During the day the bird had several times made him uncomfortable, but it had adjusted his clothes to it, and even cut a little slit for the bird to poke his beak out through the search of fresh air. Now that the day's work was over, it was finished. Scripps was on his way to the beanery. Scripps happily that he worked with his hands, thinking of the old pump makers. Scripps was going in the society of the friendly waitress. Who was that waitress anyway? What was it happened to her in Paris? He must find out more about this Paris. Yogi Jasa had been there. He would quiz Yogi, get him to talk, draw him out, make him tell him what he knew. He knew a trick or two about that. Watching the sun set over Petrovsky Harbor, the lake now frozen in great blocks of ice jutting up over the breakwater, Scripps drove down the streets of Petrovsky to the beanery. He would have liked to ask Yogi Johnson to eat with him, but he didn't dare. Not yet. That'll come later. All in good time. No need to rush. What matters with a man like Yogi? Who was Yogi anyway? Had he really been in the war? What had he meant to him? Was he really the first man to enlist from Cadillac? Where was Cadillac anyway? Time would tell. Scripps O'Neill opened the door and went into the beanery. The elderly waitress got up from the chair where she had been reading the overseas edition of the Manchester Guardian and put the paper with her steel rimmed spectacles on top of the cash register. "Good evening," she said simply. "It's good to have you back." So it stirred inside Scripps O'Neill. A feeling that he could not define came within him.
I've been working all day long.
He looked at the elderly waitress. "For you," he added. "How lovely," she said, and then smiled shyly. "And I've been working all day long for you." Tears came into Scripps' eyes. Something stirred inside of him. He reached forward to take the elderly waitress's hand. With quiet dignity, she laid it within his own. "You are my woman," he said. Tears came into his eyes, too. "You are my man," she said. "Once again I say you are my woman." Scripps pronounced the words solemnly. Something had broken inside of him again. He couldn't help but crying. "Let this be our wedding ceremony," the elderly waitress said. Scripps pressed her hand.
You are my woman,
He simply said. "You are my man and more than my man," she looked into his eyes. "You are all of America to me."
let us go,
Scripps said. "Have you your Boyd?" the waitress asked, lying aside her apron and folding her copy of the Manchester Guardian weekly. "I'll bring the Guardian if you don't mind," she said, wrapping the paper in her apron. "It's a new paper and I've not read it yet."
I'm very fond of the Guardian," Scripps said. "My family have taken it ever since I can remember. My father was a great admirer of Gladstone."
"My father went to Eton with Gladstone," the elderly waitress said. "And now I'm ready." She donned a coat and stood ready, her apron, her steel-rimmed spectacles, and the worn black morocco case and her copy of the Manchester Guardian held in her hand.
"Have you no hat?"
asked Scripps. "No,"
"Then I will buy you one."
Scripps said tenderly. "It'll be your wedding gift," the elderly waitress said. Again there were tears in her eyes.
"And now let us go."
Scripps said. The elderly waitress came out from behind the counter, and together, hand in hand, they strode out into the night. Inside the beanery, the cook pushed up the wicket and looked out through the kitchen. "They've gone off," he chuckled. "Gone into the night. Well, well, well." He closed the wicket softly. Even he was a little bit impressed. Chapter 8. Half an hour later, Scripps O'Neill and the elderly waitress returned to the beanery as man and wife. The beanery looked much the same. There were the long counter, the salt cellars, the sugar containers, the catsup bottle, the Worcestershire sauce bottle. There was the wicket that led into the kitchen. Behind the counter was a relief waitress. She was a buxom, jolly-looking girl, and she wore a white apron. At the counter, reading a Detroit paper, sat a drummer. The drummer was eating a T-bone steak and hash brown potatoes. Something very beautiful happened to Scripps and that elderly waitress. Now they were hungry. They wished to eat. The elderly waitress looking at Scripps, Scripps looking at the elderly waitress, the drummer reading his paper and occasionally putting a little catsup on his hash brown potatoes. The elder waitress, Mandy, back of the counter in her freshly starched white apron, frost on the windows, the warmth inside, the cold outside. Scripps's bird, rather rumpled now, sitting out on the counter and preening his feathers. "Oh, so you've come back," Mandy the waitress said. "The cook said you'd gone out for the night." The elderly waitress looked at Mandy, her eyes bright and her voice calm of now reached richer, deeper timbre. "We're man and wife now," she said kindly. "We have just been married. Would you like to eat for supper, Scripps dear?" "I don't know," Scripps said. He felt vaguely uneasy. Something was stirring within him. "Perhaps you have eaten enough of the beans, dear Scripps," the elderly waitress, now his wife, said. The drummer looked up from his paper. Scripps noticed that it was the Detroit News. A fine paper.
"It's a fine paper you're reading," Scripps said to the drummer.
"It's a good paper, the News," the drummer said.
"You got two on your honeymoon?"
"Yeah." "Why, yes," Mrs. Scripps said. "We are man and wife now."
"Well," the drummer said, "that's a mighty fine thing to be. I'm a married man myself."
"Are you?" Scripps said. "My wife left me. It was in Mancelona."
Don't talk of that anymore, Scripps, dear, Mrs. Scripps said. You've told me that story so many times.
"Yes, dear," Scripps agreed. He felt vaguely mistrustful of himself. Something somewhere was stirring inside of him. He looked at the waitress called Mandy, standing robust and vigorously lovely in her newly starched white apron. He watched her hands, healthy, calm, capable hands, doing the duties of waitresshood. "Try out one of these T-bones with hashed brown potatoes," the driver suggested. "They got a nice T-bone here."
Would you like to try one, dear?
"Oh, uh, uh, would you like to try one, dear?" Scripps asked his wife.
I'll just take a bowl of milk and crackers, the elderly Mrs. Scripps said. You have whatever you want, dear. Here's your crackers and milk, Diana, Mandy said, placing them on the counter. Do you want a T-bone, sir?
"Yes." Scripps said. Something stirred again in him.
Well done, a rare.
"Rare, please."
Waitress turned and called into the wicket. Tea for one, let it go raw.
"Thank you," Scripps said. He eyed the waitress, Mandy. She had a gift for picturesque speech, that girl. It had been very picturesque in quality in her speech that had first drawn him to his present wife. That and her strange background. England, the Lake Country. Scripps was striding through the Lake Country with Wordsworth, a field of golden daffodils, the wind blowing at Windermere, far off perhaps a stag at bay. Ah, that was farther north in Scotland. There were a hardly race those Scots, and the mountains and their fastness. Harry Lauder with his pipe, the Highlanders in the Great War. Why not he? Why hadn't he, Scripps, been in the war? There was what if that chap Yodi Johnson had it on him. The war would have meant much to him, Scripps. Why hadn't he been in it? Why hadn't he heard of it in time? Perhaps he was too old. Look at the old French General Joffre, though. Surely he was a younger man than the old general. General Foch praying for victory. The French troops kneeling along the Chemin des Dames, praying for victory. The Germans with their Gott mit uns. What a mockery. He surely wondered. He was no older than that French General Foch. He wondered. Mandy, his waitress, placed his T-bone steak and hashed brown potatoes on the counter before him. As she laid the plate down just for an instant, her hand touched his. Scripps felt a strange thrill go through him. Life was before him. He was not an old man. Why were there no wars now? Perhaps there were. Men were fighting in China. Chinese killing one another. What for? Scripps wondered. What was it all about, anyway? Mandy, the buxom waitress, leaned forward. Say, she said, did I ever tell you the last words of Henry James? Really, dear Mandy, Scripps said, you've told the story rather often. "Let's hear it," Scripps said. "I'm very interested in Henry James." Henry James, that chap who had gone away from his own land to live in England among the Englishmen. Why had he done it? For what had he left America? Weren't his roots there? His brother William, Boston, pragmatism, Harvard University, old John Harvard with silver buckles on his shoes, Charlie Brickley, Eddie Mahan. Where were they now? Well, Mandy began, Henry James became a British subject on his deathbed. At once, as soon as the king heard Henry James had become a British subject, he sent around the highest decoration of his power to bestow the Order of Merit. The O.M., the elderly Miss Scripps explained. That was it, the waitress said. Professor Ghost and Saintsbury came with the man who brought the decoration. Henry James, lying on his deathbed. His eyes were shut. There was a single candle on the table beside the bed. The nurse allowed them to come to bed and put a ribbon of decoration round James's neck, and the decoration lay on the sheet over Henry James's chest. Professors Gross and Saintsbury leaned forward and smoothed the ribbon of decoration. Henry James never opened his eyes. The nurse told them all they must go out of the room, and they all went out of the room. When they were gone, Henry James spoke to the nurse, but he never opened his eyes. Yes, Henry James said, put out the candle, nurse, and spare my blushes. Those were the last words he ever spoke.
James was quite a writer.
Scripps O'Neill said. He was strangely moved by the story.
You don't always tell it the same. Oh, you don't always tell it the same way, dear.
Mrs. Scripps remarked Mandy. There were tears in Mandy's eyes.
I feel very strongly about Henry James, she said.
What was the matter with James?
Oh, wait, no, I don't. Can't keep my voices straight. What's wrong with me? Shouts out Octawave. Shouts out against the word G.
What was the matter with James?
Asked the drummer. Wasn't America good enough for him? Scripps O'Neill was thinking about Mandy the waitress. What a background she must have, that girl. What a fund of anecdotes. Chap could go far with a woman like that to help. He stroked the little bird that sat on the lunch counter before him. The little bird pecked at his finger. Was the little bird a hawk, a falcon perhaps, from one of those big Michigan falconries? Was it perhaps a robin, pulling and tugging on some early worm on some green lawn somewhere, he wondered?
What do you call your boy?
The drummer asked. I haven't named him yet. What would you call him?
Why not call him Ariel? Mandy asked. Or Puck, Mrs. Scripps put in.
What does it mean? Asked the drummer.
It's a character out of Shakespeare, Mandy explained.
Oh, give the bird a chance.
What would you call him?
Scripps turned to the drummer.
He ain't a parrot, is he?
Asked the drummer.
If he was a parrot, you could probably call him Polly.
There's a character in the Beggar's Opera
called Polly. Mandy explained. Scripps wondered perhaps the bird was a parrot. The parrot stayed in some comfortable home with an old maid, but untiled soil of New England spinster. Better wait to see how it comes out, the drummer advised.
You got plenty of time to name it.
The drummer had sound ideas. He, Scripps, did not even know what sex the bird was, whether it was a boy or a girl or...
Will you see if he lays eggs?
The drummer suggested. Scripps looked at the drummer's eyes. The fellow had voiced his unspoken thought.
You know a thing or two, drummer, he said.
Well, the drummer admitted modestly,
I ain't drummed all these years for nothing.
You're right there, pal, Scripps said. That's a nice boyd you got there, brother, the drummer said. You want to hang on to that boyd. Scripps knew it. These drummers know a thing or two, going up and down the face of this great America. As far as these drummers keep their eyes open, they were no fools. Listen, the drummer said. He pushed his derby hat off his brow, leaning forward, sitting on the tall grass. But he spat onto the tall brass cuspidor that stood below his stool. I want you to tell me about a pretty thing that happened once in Bay City. Annie, the waitress, leaned forward. Mrs. Scripps leaned toward the drummer to hear better. The drummer looked apologetically at Scripps and stroked the bird with his forefinger. Tell you about it some other time, brother, he said, and Scripps understood. From out of the kitchen, through the wicket in the hall, came a high-pitched, haunting laugh. Scripps listened. Could that be the laughter of the cook, he wondered? Chapter 9. Scripps slowly going to work in the pump factory in the mornings. Mrs. Scripps looking out of the window and watching him go up the street. Not much time for reading The Guardian now. Not much time for reading about English politics. Not much time for worrying about the cabinet crisis over there in France. The French were strange people. Joan of Arc, Yves Le Guin, Clemenceau, Georges Carpentier, Sacha Guillory, Yvonne Printemps, Roch, Le Frontenac, Gilbertides, the Dial Prize, Marianne Moore, Amy Cummings, The Enormous Room, Vanity Fair, Frank Crowenshield. What was it all about? Where was he taking her? She had a man now, a man of her own, for her own. Could she keep him? Could she hold on to him for her own, she wondered. Mrs. Scripps, formerly an elderly waitress, now the wife of Scripps O'Neill, with a good job in the pump factory. Diana Scripps, Diana was her own name. It had been his mother's too, Diana Scripps looking into the mirror, wondering, could she hold him? It was getting to be a question. Why had he ever met Mandy? Would he have the courage to break off going into the restaurant with Scripps to eat? She couldn't do that. He would go alone. She knew that. There was no use trying to pull wool over her own eyes. He would go alone, and he would talk with Mandy. Diana looked into the mirror. Could she hold him? Could she hold him? That thought never left her now. Every night in the restaurant she couldn't call it a beanery now. That made a lump of cum in her throat. It made her throat feel hard and chunky. Every night at the restaurant now, Scripps and Mandy talked together. The girl was trying to take him away. Him, her, Scripps, trying to take him away. Take him away. Could she, Diana, hold him? She was no better than a slut, that Mandy. But was that the way to do? Was that the thing to do? Go after another woman's man? Come between a man and wife? Break up a home? And all with these interminable literary reminiscences, all these endless anecdotes. Scripps was fascinated by Mandy. Diana admitted that to herself, but she might hold him. That was all that mattered now, to hold him and not let go, to make him stay. She looked into the mirror. Diana subscribing for the Forum. Diana reading The Meteor. Diana reading William Lloyd Phelps' The Scribners. Diana walking through the frozen streets in the silent northern town of the public library to read the Literary Digest book review. Diana waiting for the postman to come bring the bookman. Diana in the snow waiting for the postman to bring the Saturday Review of Literature. Diana bareheaded now, standing in the mounting snowdrifts waiting for the postman to bring her New York Times literary section. Was it doing any good? Was it holding him? At first it seemed to be. Diana learned editorials by John Farr by heart. Scripps brightened, a little of the old light shining in Scripps's eyes now. Then it died, some little mistake in the wording, some little slip in her understanding of a phrase, some divergence in her attitude, made it all ring false. She would go on. She was not beaten. He was her man, and she would hold him. She looked away from the window and slid over to the covering of the magazine that lay on the table. It was Harper's Magazine. Harper's Magazine in a new format. Harper's Magazine completely changed and revised. Perhaps that would do the trick, she wondered. Chapter 10. Spring was coming. Spring was in the air. Author's note, this is the same day on which the story starts, back on page 3. The Chinook wind was blowing. Workmen were coming home from the factory. Scripps' bird was singing in his cage, Diana looking out into the open window. Diana watching her Scripps to come up the street. Could she hold him? If she couldn't hold him, wouldn't he leave her his bird? She felt lately she couldn't hold him. In the nights now, when she touched Scripps, he rolled away, not toward her. There was little sign, but life was made up of little signs. She felt she couldn't hold him. She looked out the window. A copy of the Century magazine dropped from her nerveless hand. The Century had a new editor. There were more woodcuts. Glenn Frank had gone to the head of some great university somewhere. There was more Van Dorns in the magazine. Diana felt that it might turn the trick. Happily she opened the Century and read all morning. Then the wind, the warm Chinook wind, started to blow, and she knew Scripps would soon be home. Men were coming down the street in increasing numbers. Was Scripps among them? She didn't like to put on her spectacles to look. She wanted Scripps' first glimpse of her to be at her best. As she felt him drawing near, the confidence she had in the Century grew fainter. She had hoped that would give her something to which would hold him. She wasn't sure now. Scripps coming down the street with a crowd of excited workmen. Men stirred by spring. Scripps swinging his lunch bucket. Scripps waving goodbye to the workmen who trooped one by one into what had formerly been a saloon. Scripps not looking up at the window. Scripps coming up the stairs. Scripps coming nearer. Scripps coming near. Scripps here. Good afternoon, dear Scripps, she said. I've been reading a story about Ruth Sucklow. Hi, Diana, Scripps answered. He set down his lunch pail. She looked worn and old. He could afford to be polite.
What was the story about, Diana?
It was about a little girl in Iowa, Diana said. She moved toward him. It was about people on the land. It reminded me a little of my own lake country.
Is that so?
Scripps asked. In some ways, the pump factory had hardened. His speech had become more clipped, more like these hardy northern workers, but his mind was the same.
Would you like me to read a little of it out loud? Diana said, there's some very lovely woodcuts.
How about going down to the beanery? Scripps said.
As you wish, dear, Diana said, and then her voice broke. I wish, oh, I wish you'd never seen that place. She wiped away her tears. Scripps had not even seen them. I'll bring the boy, dear, Diana said. He hasn't been out all day. They went down to the street to the beanery. They did not walk hand in hand now. They walked like they were an old married couple. Mrs. Scripps carried the bird cage. The bird was happy in the warm wind. Men lurching along, drunk with the spring, passed them. Many spoke to Scripps. He was well known and well liked in the town now. Some, as they lurched by, raised their hats to Mrs. Scripps. She responded vaguely. If I can only hold him, she was thinking. If I can only hold him. They walked along the slushy snow of the narrow sidewalk of the northern town. Something began to beat in her head. Perhaps it was the rhythm of their walking together. I can't hold him. I can't hold him. I can't hold him. Scripps took her arm as they crossed the street. When his hand touched her arm, Diana knew it was true. She would never hold him. A group of Indians passed him in the street. Were they laughing at her, or was it some tribal jest? Diana didn't know. All she knew was that rhythm that beat into her brain. I can't hold him. I can't hold him. Author's note for the reader, not the printer. What difference does it make to the printer? Who is the printer anyway? Gutenberg? The Gutenberg Bible? Caxton? 12-point open-face Carlson? The linotype machine? The author is a little boy being sent to look for type lice. The author is a young man being sent to look for the key to the forums. Ah, they knew a trick or two, these printers. In case the reader is becoming confused, we are now up to where the story opened, with Yogi Johnson and Scripps O'Neill at the pump factory itself, where the Chinook wind blowing. As you see, Scripps O'Neill was now come out of the pump factory and is on his way to the beanery with his wife, who is afraid she cannot hold him. Personally, we don't believe she can, but the reader will see for himself. We will now leave the couple on their way to the beanery and go back up and take up Yogi Johnson. We want the reader to like Yogi Johnson. The story will move a little faster from now on in case any of the readers are tiring. We will also try to work in a number of good anecdotes. Would there be any violation of the confidence if we told the reader that we would get the best of these anecdotes from Mr. Ford Maddox Ford? We owe him our thanks, and we hope the reader does too. At any rate, we will now go with Yogi Johnson. Yogi Johnson, the reader may remember, is the chap who was in the war. As the story opens, he is just coming out of the pump factory. See page 3. It is very hard to write this way, beginning things backward, and the author hopes that the reader will realize this and not grudge this little word of explanation. I know that I would be very glad to read anything the reader ever wrote, and I hope the reader will make the same sort of allowances. If any readers would care to send me anything they ever wrote for criticism or advice, I am always at the Café du Dôme any afternoon, talking about art with Harold Stearns and Sinclair Lewis. And the reader can bring his stuff along with him, or he can send it to me at my bank, if I have a bank. Now, if my reader is ready and understand, I don't want to rush the reader any, we will go back to Yogi Johnson. But please remember that while we have gone back to Yogi Johnson, Scripps O'Neill and his wife are on their way to the beanery. What will happen to them there, I don't know. I only wish the reader could help me. Oh man, that's the halfway mark. Part 3. Men in War and the Death of Society. It may likewise be noted that affection does not imply the absolute negotiation of those qualities which are affected, and therefore, though when proceeds from hypocrisy, it be nearly allied to deceit, yet when it comes from vanity only, it partakes in the nature of ostentation. For instance, the affection of the liberality in vain man differs visibly from the same affection of the avaricious. For though the vain man is not without a fear, or hath not the virtue he affects to a degree which he thought would have it, yet it sits less awkwardly on him than on the avaricious man, who is very reverse of what he would seem to be. Henry Fielding. That's your quote. We're going to leave out on that quote. And
Gosh, I feel like it's very short, but we really only have 5 minutes left until it kicks us off for the evening. So this brief remainder of this book will be picked up in a part 2. I know. I promised y'all we were going to try and read this all in like an hour and a half, but as you can see, it's just not quite there. So, let me find a bookmark. Thank you all so much for tuning in. One more time, run you through the shout outs. Mad love goes out to Ernest HEMINGWEEZY and his family. One of the greatest writers of the 21st century. Shouts out. Against the world, G. Shouts out Octawave, Dog, Rose, Don't Watch, Continue. Pythagoras, Renzo, Flutes. The rest of his Japanese gang as well. All of the fine folks over at the r/alternate history hub Discord page, as well as Brittany and Rakeem, who tune into these things sometimes, and Octawave, who had to show up with the goats. Thank you for the goats, by the way, Octawave. Mad love to you, as we reading about goats right now, in a figurative sense. Oh man, but I guess we have to call it quits for the evening. Thank you so much to everybody. All kinds of love. Faux Faith, NFA. We out, y'all. One love.